Have you ever stared at the pills your devoted husband feeds you every single morning and realized they were meant to slowly erase you? People claim abuse begins with bruises, but my trap was woven with fake medical diagnoses and one warm glass of water. Lock your doors and listen closely to how I fled my own home. Sometimes, the devil does not wear a cloak. He wears a white coat and calls you his sweet wife. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our monetization, leaving the channel without a budget to keep running. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team and continue bringing you more stories. You can support us by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments section below. My name is Heidi Rojas, and this is my story. The freezing rain of the Denver suburbs felt like needles piercing my soaked clothes, but I could not stop moving. My lungs burned with every jagged breath, and the icy wind whipped my wet hair across my face. I am 29 years old, but tonight, dragging my body through the unforgiving storm, I felt like a broken shell, clutched tightly against my chest. Hidden safely beneath the heavy folds of my winter coat was my 8-month-old son, Leo. I could feel his tiny, rhythmic heartbeat against my ribs, the only source of warmth keeping me from collapsing onto the freezing asphalt. Every step was an agonizing battle. My right ankle throbbed with a sickening, fiery pain. It was severely swollen, the result of a desperate leap from the first-floor window of my own home. That room was supposed to be my safe haven, my designated recovery room. But in reality, it was a locked cell. I had no wallet, no identification, and the cell phone in my pocket was completely useless, its SIM card intentionally deactivated by the very man who promised to love and protect me. The darkness of the neighborhood offered a temporary shroud, but the paralyzing fear of being hunted pushed me forward. The silence of the night was deafening, broken only by the splashing of my own erratic footsteps in the puddles and the howling Colorado wind. Suddenly, the blinding beam of heavy headlights pierced the curtain of rain, sweeping across the dark street and pinning me like a spotlight. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Panic seized my throat as a large, heavy-duty electrical repair truck screeched to a halt just a few yards away. For a terrifying second, I thought he had found me. Then, the heavy driver door violently swung open. A figure lunged out into the downpour. As the man stepped into the halo of the headlights, my knees nearly buckled with a mixture of immense relief and sheer exhaustion. It was my father, Marcus Rojas, a highly skilled former industrial electrician who still drove his old company work truck. He rushed toward me, his face twisting into a mask of absolute horror as he took in the sight of his daughter. I knew what I must look like to him in that blinding light, a ghostly, battered apparition, soaked to the bone, trembling violently, and limping like a wounded animal. "Heidi," he gasped, his voice cracking with panic as his strong hands grabbed my shoulders to steady me. He quickly noticed the heavy bundle of my coat and realized I was holding little Leo. "Oh my God, Heidi, what happened? Your illness, is it the disease again? You should not be out here." Without waiting for an answer, his hand frantically reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to dial 911. He thought my rare neurodegenerative condition had caused a severe episode, driving me into a state of delirium, summoning every ounce of remaining strength. I lunged forward, my cold, shaking fingers clamped down hard over his hand, stopping him from making the call. I looked up into his frantic eyes. I did not cry. There was no room left for tears, only a sharp, cold clarity. "Do not call anyone," I rasped, my voice barely a whisper but laced with an absolute, undeniable urgency. "Put the phone away!" My father froze, confusion warring with the terror in his eyes. "Heidi, you need a hospital. You need a doctor right now." I tightened my grip on his shirt, pulling him closer so the roaring wind would not steal my words. I stared directly into his soul and delivered the truth that would shatter our entire reality. "I am not sick, Dad," I whispered, every word sharp and deliberate. "They are poisoning me." The words hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain. For one long, agonizing second, Marcus Rojas simply stopped breathing. The skilled technician who had spent decades diagnosing complex electrical faults processed the horrific truth in my eyes. The confusion instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a terrifying, lethal calmness. He did not ask questions. He did not demand proof. He simply grabbed my waist, practically lifting me and Leo off the ground, and shoved us into the warm cab of his truck. He slammed the door shut, vaulted into the driver's seat, and instantly killed the headlights. The heavy truck plunged into complete darkness. He hit the lock button, the mechanical thud echoing in the tight space, just as my father slammed his foot on the gas pedal. Steering the heavy vehicle silently into the shadowy alleyway, a familiar sleek black SUV tore around the corner of the intersection we had just left. It was my husband. The vehicle slowed down, its bright high beams sweeping aggressively across the very spot where I had been standing just moments before, hunting for a ghost that had already vanished into the night. As the heater in my father's truck began to thaw my frozen limbs, the rhythmic humming of the engine pulled my mind away from the dark alleyway. I slipped backward, retreating 1.5 years into a past that now felt like a cruel, distant mirage. Before the dragging foot, before the constant, suffocating fog in my brain, I was a force of nature. I worked as a senior project manager at AeroPeak Aviation Dynamics. My days were measured in multi-million-dollar aerospace contracts, precise engineering timelines, and the sharp, confident click of my high heels on polished marble floors. I was entirely financially independent, a status firmly cemented when I inherited a massive real estate trust fund from my late grandmother. I had built an absolute fortress of a life, and standing right at the center of it was my husband, Julian Vance. Julian was a high-end financial consultant, the kind of charismatic man who wore bespoke suits, commanded every room he entered, and always knew exactly what to say to make you feel like the center of the universe, to the outside world, and certainly to me. He was the epitome of a devoted, loving partner. He brought me fresh coffee in bed every single morning, kissed my forehead tenderly before leaving for his firm, and always spoke of our future family with shining, emotional eyes. And then there was his older sister, Valerie Vance. Valerie was the esteemed director of an exclusive, ultra-luxury private rehabilitation clinic, catering only to the city's wealthy elite. Looking back through the lens of clarity, I should have seen the invisible, tightening net they were weaving around my assets and my life, but I was entirely blinded by love and the intoxicating promise of a perfect family. The nightmare did not start with a dramatic, cinematic collapse. It crept in softly, arriving just a few weeks after I gave birth to little Leo. At first, I chalked it up to severe postpartum exhaustion and the sleepless nights of motherhood. A sudden wave of intense dizziness while standing at the kitchen counter, a slight, frightening loss of balance on the staircase, but soon, a terrifying, heavy weakness began to seep deep into my muscles. The most alarming symptom was the frequent, unpredictable paralysis that would suddenly grip my right leg. I would try to stand up from the nursery rocking chair, only to have my leg buckle entirely beneath me, sending me crashing hard to the wooden floor with my fragile newborn clutched desperately to my chest. Panic became my daily, agonizing companion. I felt my sharp, highly capable mind being trapped inside a failing, broken vessel. When I begged Julian to take me to the state hospital neurology department for a full panel of tests, he immediately wrapped his arms around me, stroking my hair with a face that painted a perfect picture of heartbroken concern. "No, my sweet wife," he murmured softly, pressing his warm lips to my trembling temple. "Public hospitals are horribly understaffed and overwhelmed. You are too fragile for that environment. You deserve the absolute best care money can buy. We are keeping this in the family. Valerie is going to take care of you. I promise." I was simply too exhausted and terrified to argue. Julian drove me straight to Valerie's pristine, gleaming private clinic. Sitting in her grand office, surrounded by the smell of sterile lavender and expensive leather furniture, Valerie looked over my fabricated test results with a deeply sympathetic, almost mournful frown. With a clinical calmness, she diagnosed me with a rare, aggressive postpartum neuromuscular debilitating disorder. She used massive, complex medical terms that washed over my panicked brain, painting a bleak, devastating picture of rapidly declining motor functions. She held my cold, shaking hand tightly, and promised she had a highly specialized treatment protocol that could slow the terrifying progression. I wept with immense gratitude, completely unaware that the woman smiling at me had just calmly read me my death sentence. Under the righteous banner of protecting my fragile health, Julian systematically began to dismantle my entire existence. The very first thing to go was my hard-earned career, without ever asking for my consent or even discussing it. He used his legal authority as my medical proxy and devoted husband to contact the Human Resources Department at Aeropeak. He submitted Valerie's forged medical documents and officially placed me on an indefinite medical leave. When my worried colleagues tried to call or visit the house, Julian intercepted every single attempt. He played the role of the exhausted, overly protective caretaker flawlessly, telling them I was far too weak for visitors, warning that any outside stimulation would cause a severe neurological seizure. Within a matter of 2 short months, I was completely severed from the outside world, entirely cut off from the professional network and friends that had always kept me grounded. Then came the final, most chilling phase of my imprisonment. My beautiful sunlit master bedroom was entirely remodeled by Valerie's private contractors into what they affectionately called a specialized recovery room. In stark reality, they were meticulously building a gilded cage. They installed a heavy mechanical medical bed, thick blackout curtains to control the light, and padded safety corners. But the most sinister additions were the ones cleverly disguised as acts of love and safety. A heavy-duty digital smart lock was installed on the outside of the bedroom door. Julian claimed it was strictly to prevent home intruders from reaching me while I was incapacitated in bed. High-resolution surveillance cameras were mounted high in every corner of the room, recording every single movement 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. "It is just in case you faint while holding Leo," Julian had whispered to me one evening, gently wiping away a stray tear of frustration from my cheek. "I need to know you and the baby are perfectly safe when I'm working downstairs. I could never live with myself if you fell and I did not see it happen immediately." His reasoning sounded so profoundly loving, so incredibly selfless. I swallowed the lie whole. I obediently took the colorful pills Valerie prescribed, gratefully drank the warm water Julian poured for me every morning, and allowed them to lock the heavy door from the outside. I sat day after day in that quiet, heavily monitored room, watching my own muscles seemingly waste away, entirely convinced that my own body was cruelly betraying me. I never once suspected that the true, terrifying betrayal was standing right beside my bed, smiling warmly down at me while holding the key to my cage. The insidious nature of psychological warfare is that you eventually become your own warden. Month after relentless month, the heavy sedatives and the constant, whispered reassurances from Julian worked like a dark magic, completely breaking my spirit. I genuinely began to believe I was a shattered, defective human being. I would lie in that mechanical bed, weeping silently as I watched my own hands tremble, entirely convinced that my body was failing and that I was utterly unfit to be a mother to my beautiful son. I had surrendered to the darkness. Then came the single, fatal mistake that unraveled their entire masterpiece. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Julian had brought me my lunch, feeding me spoonfuls of lukewarm soup with the patience of a saint. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A sudden, urgent call from his firm. He quickly set his tablet down on the plush leather sofa near the foot of my bed, kissed my cheek, and hurried out of the room, firmly locking the heavy door behind him. In his haste, he had forgotten to press the power button. The screen remained brightly illuminated, glowing in the dimly lit room. An inexplicable, primal instinct surged through my sluggish veins. My right leg dragged heavily behind me like a sack of dead weight, but I forced myself out of the bed. I crawled across the thick carpet, gasping with exertion, until my trembling fingers grasped the cold metal edge of the tablet. I pulled it onto my lap. I did not know what I was looking for, but the moment I swiped the screen, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. He had left a specialized hidden surveillance application open. I stared in absolute horror at a grid of live video feeds. It was not just the bedroom. There were hidden cameras in the master bathroom, the nursery, and the hallway. But the true terror lay in the files categorized beneath the video feeds. My shaking finger tapped on a folder labeled Audio Logs. Inside, I found dozens of intercepted phone calls, every desperate, weeping voicemail I had secretly tried to leave for my old friends at Arrow Peak, begging them to come see me, had been blocked and routed directly to this device. But the sheer psychotic depths of Julian's control were revealed in the next folder. He had utilized advanced artificial intelligence software to sample those recordings and digitally clone my exact voice. I sat completely paralyzed on the floor, listening to a synthesized, flawless version of myself cheerfully telling my closest friends that I was recovering peacefully in a private countryside retreat and requested absolute privacy. He was systematically erasing my existence, using my own stolen voice to bolt the doors of my prison. A violent wave of nausea washed over me, but the despair abruptly mutated into a blinding, white-hot rage when a new message notification dropped down from the top of the screen. It was a text message from his sister, Valerie. My eyes locked onto the words, reading them over and over until they burned into my retinas. Today's dosage of muscle relaxants and sedatives is enough so she cannot stand. Get the power of attorney paperwork ready. The words triggered a seismic shift in my brain. The fog of confusion instantly evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp, lethal clarity. I was not dying of a rare neurological disease. I was being chemically paralyzed. The man who kissed me goodnight, the father of my child, was meticulously poisoning me with heavily controlled off-label prescription drugs to steal my entire life. I was not a patient. I was a prey trapped in a slaughterhouse. I carefully placed the tablet back exactly where he had left it, dragging myself back into the bed just seconds before the electronic lock clicked open. When Julian walked back in, smiling that handsome, hollow smile, I looked at him differently. The terrified, dependent wife was dead. In her place was a woman forged from pure, calculating vengeance. The counterattack began the very next morning. When Julian brought me my daily cocktail of brightly colored pills and my glass of warm water, I feigned a coughing fit. I brought the water to my lips, but subtly slipped the heavy pills under my tongue. As soon as he turned around to adjust the blackout curtains, I spat the dissolving capsules into the palm of my hand and shoved them deep into a hidden crack beneath the heavy mattress seam. I repeated this dangerous performance flawlessly for 3 consecutive days. The withdrawal was absolute agony. My body shook violently. Cold sweats drenched my nightgowns, and my head pounded as the heavy chemical restraint slowly flushed from my bloodstream. But by the dawn of the 4th day, a miraculous, undeniable sensation occurred. A sharp tingling ran down my right thigh. I wiggled my toes. The heavy, dead paralysis that had chained me to that bed was gone. When Julian was out of the room, I stood up. My legs wobbled, weak from months of forced atrophy. But they held my weight. The blinding dizziness had vanished completely. I knew that if I simply confronted him, I would never leave that house alive. I needed to escape, and I needed the perfect opening to lower his guard. I dramatically escalated my acting. I pretended my condition had severely deteriorated. I slurred my words heavily, let my eyes roll back into my head, and allowed my body to go completely limp whenever he lifted me. I saw the sickening flash of triumph in his eyes. He firmly believed the drugs had finally broken my nervous system entirely. The opportunity finally arrived on a stormy night. Julian received a crucial phone call from his corporate lawyer regarding the finalization of the power of attorney documents, believing I was practically comatose. He left the bedroom door cracked open and paced down the hallway, deeply engrossed in his wicked legal maneuverings. I knew this was my only chance. I threw off the heavy blankets. Moving with deadly silence, I crept into the nursery and gently lifted a sleeping Leo from his crib, pressing his warm body tightly to my chest. I silently slipped into the master bathroom and locked the door behind me. The main bedroom door was too risky, but the bathroom had a narrow window overlooking the side yard. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I forced the cold glass window up. The freezing rain immediately slashed across my face. It was a first-floor drop, but landing on the hard concrete with weak legs while protecting a baby was incredibly dangerous. I did not hesitate, clinging fiercely to my son. I squeezed through the narrow frame and let myself fall into the darkness. My right ankle struck the pavement at a vicious angle. The bone popped with a sickening crunch, sending a blinding flash of agony up my spine. But I clamped my hand over my own mouth, swallowing the scream. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the torn ligaments and the freezing storm. I limped violently into the black suburban night, disappearing into the rain, ultimately leading my broken body straight into the blinding headlights of my father's electrical repair truck. Once we were safely locked inside my father's modest, single-story house, the heavy silence of the living room replaced the roaring storm outside. I gently laid a sleeping Leo on the center of the warm rug, wrapping him in a dry fleece blanket. My father immediately reached for the landline telephone on the kitchen counter, his knuckles white with fury, intending to call the police and report my husband for attempted murder. I stepped forward, ignoring the shooting pain in my shattered ankle, and firmly pressed my hand over the receiver. "No," I stated, my voice devoid of any hysteria. "If the police show up at Julian's door tonight, we will lose everything." My father stared at me, completely bewildered. I calmly explained the flawless, terrifying narrative my husband had spent the last year and a half meticulously building, to the outside world and to local law enforcement. I was a severely disabled, neurologically unstable mother who had just suffered a psychotic break and kidnapped her own infant. Julian had a mountain of fabricated medical documentation, backed by a highly respected clinic director, proving my mental and physical incompetence. He even had digital voice recordings of me sounding completely unhinged. If the police found me right now, they would not arrest him. They would hand my son back to his loving, worried father, and they would drag me directly to a psychiatric ward. We could not fight a monster with raw emotion. We had to dismantle him with cold, hard logic. The very next morning, before the sun even crested the horizon, my father drove me 2 hours away to a completely different county. We bypassed all the massive, state-of-the-art hospitals and walked into a small, independent, urgent care clinic. Using my maiden name and paying strictly in cash, I requested a comprehensive, expedited toxicology blood screening. Sitting on the crinkling paper of the examination table, I waited with a strange, icy calm. When the attending physician finally walked back into the room, her face was incredibly pale. She handed me the printed laboratory results. My blood was absolutely saturated with toxic, extremely high levels of industrial-grade chemical sedatives and powerful central nervous system depressants. These specific narcotics were completely absent from the fake treatment plans Valerie had officially prescribed. It was the undeniable, scientific proof I needed. I was not crazy. I was being chemically suffocated. Armed with the toxicology report, our next stop was an inconspicuous office building downtown. My father had reached out to an old hunting buddy who connected us with a ruthless, highly discreet family law attorney. Sitting across the heavy mahogany desk from the lawyer, I authorized him to quietly dig into my personal financial portfolios. What he uncovered over the next 48 hours was a financial twist so deeply sickening it made my stomach physically churn. Julian and Valerie had not just been poisoning my body, they had systematically drained my entire life. Using a heavily notarized, comprehensive medical power of attorney, a document containing a sloppy, barely legible signature I must have scribbled while heavily drugged in that locked bedroom. Julian had managed to mortgage the entirety of my grandmother's massive real estate trust fund. The lawyer slid the bank transfer records across the desk. The sheer amount of money was staggering, totaling millions of dollars. But the funds had not been allocated for any experimental neurological treatments, as Julian had claimed to his firm. Instead, every single dollar had been funneled directly into an offshore holding account controlled entirely by Valerie. The pieces of their grand, wicked puzzle finally snapped perfectly into place. Valerie's ultra-luxury rehabilitation clinic, the very place that gave her so much social power and prestige, was a massive financial facade. She was drowning in millions of dollars of corporate debt, standing right on the razor-thin edge of total bankruptcy. I was never a patient to them. I was merely a heavily sedated, walking bank account meant to bail out her failing empire. Their ultimate endgame was now terrifyingly clear. They were pushing my dosage to the absolute limit, waiting for the perfect moment to have a judge declare me completely devoid of all civil and mental capacity. Once I was permanently committed to an asylum, Julian would gain absolute legal custody of Leo and total, uncontested control over the remaining trust fund. I stared at the financial documents, feeling a dangerous, powerful fire ignite in my chest. I was done running. I was done hiding in the shadows of their deceit. It was time to become the hunter. I instructed my father to purchase a cheap, untraceable prepaid cellular phone from a local gas station. Sitting at his kitchen table, I composed a text message to Julian. I did not demand answers or threaten him with the police. Instead, I carefully crafted the message to sound exactly like the broken, confused, heavily medicated woman he expected me to be. "Julian, I am so scared," I typed, making sure to include poor punctuation. "My head is spinning and I cannot remember how I got here. I took a bus. I am hiding in a cheap motel in rural Wyoming. Please come get me. Do not tell anyone." I hit send, dropping the plastic phone onto the table. It was the perfect bait. I knew Julian's immense arrogance would never allow him to ignore such an easy target. He would think I was completely isolated, delirious, and ripe for the final capture. He had no idea that he was walking blindly into a steel trap, and I was holding the crushing jaws wide open. The bait worked flawlessly, exactly as I had predicted. Julian did not drive to Wyoming to find me. Instead, armed with the fake text message as his ultimate proof of my supposed insanity, he and Valerie immediately filed an emergency ex parte petition with the Colorado Family Court. They moved with terrifying speed, demanding a judge to permanently and immediately strip me of all maternal rights and financial control. Their official legal filing claimed that I had suffered a catastrophic, drug-resistant psychotic break, fled our secure home in a manic frenzy, and posed an imminent, lethal danger to my infant son. To ensure the presiding judge would feel the immense, suffocating weight of public opinion, Julian launched a vile, highly orchestrated public relations campaign on social media. I sat quietly in my father's dimly lit living room, staring at a laptop screen, watching my husband shed perfect, crystalline tears on camera. He wore a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, his dark hair perfectly tousled to make him look like a sleep-deprived, utterly devoted husband desperately searching for his tragically ill wife. He begged the public for prayers and information, painting himself as the ultimate tragic martyr. The video amassed hundreds of thousands of views within 48 hours. The comment sections flooded with tens of thousands of sympathetic messages, condemning the crazy wife who stole a baby. He was carefully paving a golden road for the judge to hand him my entire life on a silver platter. But while Julian was busy performing his heart out for the cameras, my father was executing a precise, surgical strike in the shadows. Marcus Rojas was not just a retired mechanic. He was a highly respected, deeply connected veteran of the local Commercial Electrical Workers Union. He knew exactly who maintained the power grid for Valerie's luxury rehabilitation clinic. Late one evening, under the absolute guise of a sudden, catastrophic main breaker failure, my father and two of his oldest, Most trusted union brothers bypassed the clinic's main security desk, while his friends created a massive, chaotic distraction with sparking wires and blown fuses in the basement. My father slipped silently into the main server room on the second floor. He did not need to hack complex firewalls. He simply plugged a high-capacity, encrypted hard drive directly into the physical master server. Within 20 short minutes, he walked out of the building with the clinic's entire hidden digital footprint, including the heavily guarded secondary ledger that detailed every single phantom prescription and illegal narcotic order Valerie had ever authorized. With the undeniable medical and financial evidence fully secured, I needed a legal force powerful enough to crush Julian's high-priced defense lawyers into absolute dust. I picked up the phone and dialed a private number I had not called in over 18 months. It was the personal line of the chief executive officer at Aero Peak Aviation Dynamics, my former boss. He had always viewed me as one of his sharpest, most relentless project strategists. When he answered, I did not cry or beg. I spent 45 solid minutes methodically laying out the entire horrifying truth of my imprisonment, the deliberate chemical poisoning, and the multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. The line remained deadly silent for one long, heavy moment before my boss finally spoke. "Nobody touches one of my people," he growled, his voice vibrating with absolute, protective fury. "I am sending the hounds." Within 2 short hours, the senior partners of Aero Peak's ruthless elite corporate litigation team arrived at my father's house. They did not just take my case, they absorbed it, turning my mountain of raw evidence into a lethal, inescapable legal labyrinth. They operated entirely in the dark, utilizing sealed filings and back-channel communications, ensuring Julian's legal team remained completely blind to the impending slaughter. The morning of the emergency hearing finally dawned, gray and aggressively bitter cold. Inside the grand, echoing halls of the Colorado Family Courthouse, Julian and Valerie made their grand entrance. They walked through the heavy carved oak doors with an air of absolute, untouchable triumph. Julian wore his finest tailored charcoal suit, while Valerie carried a thick, imposing leather briefcase overflowing with dozens of fabricated medical charts and psychiatric evaluations. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table, whispering confidently to their expensive attorney, completely secure in their total victory. They fully believed I was shivering in some dirty, isolated roadside motel hundreds of miles away, lost in a permanent chemical haze. They were absolutely certain that when the judge called my name, there would be nothing but empty silence, legally cementing their absolute control over my son and my massive fortune. They sat there, smiling softly, completely unaware that the storm was no longer approaching. The storm was already inside the building. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom were closed tight, sealing in the suffocating atmosphere of Julian's masterful performance. Standing before the stern-faced family court judge, Julian's high-priced attorney was just wrapping up a sickeningly theatrical closing statement. He spoke in hushed, mournful tones, painting a vivid, tragic picture of a devoted husband forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. He described me as a deeply fractured, permanently disabled woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. He pleaded with the judge to grant immediate, total custody of my 8-month-old son and full emergency control over my financial estate, claiming it was the only way to protect the child from his insane, crippled mother. Julian sat beside his lawyer, his head bowed perfectly, squeezing his eyes shut to force out one final, agonizing tear for the court stenographer to document. Right at the exact second the judge raised his gavel to rule on the emergency petition, the massive double doors at the back of the courtroom burst completely open. The heavy wood slammed against the marble walls with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. The entire room spun around. The fake tear instantly froze on Julian's face. Valerie physically dropped her expensive gold pen onto the table. I stepped over the threshold, and the air in the room was instantly sucked out. I was not wearing the damp, filthy clothes of a shivering fugitive, nor the sterile hospital gowns they had trapped me in for the past year and a half. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored black business suit. My posture was perfectly straight, radiating absolute, unbreakable authority. I was not leaning on a cane, and my right leg did not drag or limp for even a fraction of an inch. I walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, rhythmic click of stiletto heels. Resting peacefully against my shoulder was a perfectly healthy, warmly dressed baby Leo. Flanking me on my right was my father, Marcus, his jaw set in cold stone. On my left strode the senior litigation partner from Aero Peak Aviation Dynamics, followed closely by two associates hauling massive briefcases. Julian's face drained of all human color. He looked like a man staring directly at a ghost that had just crawled out of a grave he dug himself. He gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. "Your Honor," my lead attorney announced, his voice booming across the silent room with the force of a tidal wave. "We represent Heidi Rojas. We formally object to this entire fraudulent proceeding, and we bring forth evidence of a massive, coordinated criminal conspiracy." Before Julian's frantic lawyer could even formulate an objection, my legal team unleashed absolute hell. The trap did not just snap shut, it pulverized them. First, my lawyer slapped the independent, certified toxicology screening directly onto the judge's bench. He aggressively detailed the massive lethal concentrations of industrial sedatives and unprescribed muscle relaxants found in my bloodstream just 48 hours prior. Then, the true nightmare for Julian began. My lawyer set up a large digital display and hit play. The entire courtroom watched in stunned, absolute silence as crystal clear, hidden camera footage filled the screen. It was the very same surveillance system Julian had installed to imprison me. But now, it showed him standing in our master bathroom, his back partially turned, methodically emptying heavy capsules of highly restricted narcotics into my morning glass of water. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Valerie jumped to her feet, screaming that the video was a deepfake, completely losing her polished, elite medical director persona, but my attorney simply smiled like a shark and dropped the final, crushing anvil. He distributed the meticulously traced financial documents my father had extracted from the clinic's master server. The papers explicitly detailed the forged medical power of attorney and the illegal transfer of millions of dollars from my grandmother's trust fund directly into Valerie's failing offshore accounts. But the ultimate, fatal twist had not even walked into the room yet. As Julian desperately tried to whisper to his panicked lawyer, the side door of the courtroom opened. A middle-aged woman in a simple gray dress walked toward the witness stand. Valerie let out a strangled, terrified gasp. It was the former head nurse of Valerie's luxury clinic, a dedicated professional whom Valerie had ruthlessly and unjustly fired 6 months ago for daring to question the absurdly high narcotic orders being filled under my name. Under oath, the nurse looked Valerie dead in the eyes and confirmed every single horrific detail. She testified that she was violently threatened and forced to log the toxic prescriptions, confirming that the signatures on the release forms were entirely fabricated by the clinic director herself. The judge's face turned a terrifying shade of crimson. The gavel came down, not to grant Julian custody, but to shatter his entire universe. The judge instantly dismissed the emergency petition with extreme prejudice. He then looked directly at the back of the room, where 2 armed county sheriff deputies had been standing guard. "Officers," the judge commanded, his voice shaking with absolute disgust, "take Julian Vance and Valerie Vance into immediate custody. I am holding them without bail on preliminary charges of severe financial fraud, medical forgery, grand larceny, and felony intentional assault." Julian tried to run. He actually took 2 frantic steps toward the gallery before a heavy deputy slammed him face first onto the polished wooden table. The loud, sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. Valerie simply collapsed into her chair, weeping hysterically as an officer read her rights. I stood there, holding my son, looking down at the man who had tried to erase my existence. I did not shed a single tear. I did not say a word. I simply let him look into my cold eyes as they dragged him out of the room in absolute disgrace. The aftermath was swift and completely merciless. Julian eventually faced trial and was sentenced to 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Valerie's luxurious clinic empire was instantly seized by federal authorities, her assets frozen and liquidated, and her medical license permanently revoked before she too was sent to federal prison. Through the relentless work of my legal team, every single stolen dollar of my trust fund was fully recovered and secured. I did not just return to Aero Peak Aviation Dynamics. The board of directors promoted me to the position of Senior Vice President of Operations. A few months later, I stood in the foyer of a beautiful, sunlit new home that I bought entirely on my own. I knelt down on the soft carpet, a shiny new brass key resting in the palm of my hand. I had just changed every single lock on the heavy front doors myself. I looked over into the living room, watching little Leo laugh and play safely in the warm morning light. I realized then that the deepest wounds do eventually heal, but they leave behind an unbreakable armor. The greatest revenge is not screaming in a courtroom. The greatest revenge is taking back control of your own legs, walking firmly, and letting those who tried to destroy you rot in their own decay. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for staying with me and listening to my journey today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments. If you found my story compelling and want to support the incredible team behind this channel, please consider helping with just $1. Your kindness allows the staff to feed their families and continue creating these amazing stories for you. You can easily do so by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you. Stay safe, and always trust your own strength.